Good afternoon. I'm William Daugherty. I'm the author of the book, The Eighth U.S. Air Force in World War II, subtitled Building American Air Power. The book came to me as I was working in the Research Center at the National Museum of the Mighty Eighth Air Force here in Savannah, Georgia. Growing up, the part of the Eighth Air Force that I was aware of and only thought about, if I thought about it at all, was the 1944-1945 period when everything was well established in England. General Doolittle was the commander, and the raids into Germany were anywhere from a few hundred airplanes to well over 1,000. It never occurred to me that to look at what the United States Army Air Forces were like at the time of Pearl Harbor. As a, let's say, a docent at the or a researcher at the National Museum of the Mighty Eighth here in Savannah, I gradually became aware of what it took to stand up the Eighth Air Force and who the players were. And it was a real revelation to me, as perhaps it was or will be to you as we go through this. In 1938, the United States Air Corps, as it was known at the time, Army Air Corps, had about 2,200 officers and about 2,600 enlisted. By 1944, it was 2.7 million, which was an incredible growth rate. And the airplanes that it had in 1938 or so were only about 2,000, of which maybe 800 or so were qualified or able to be considered first line aircraft, and everything else, according to the chief at the time, who was Henry H. Hap Arnold, were antiquated and obsolete. So when the British came over to talk to the United States in the late winter, early spring of 1941. They were already at war, had been at war with Germany for 2 years. Were flying their first of the line aircraft, including the Spitfire and the Hawker Hunter. And for bombers, they had several twin engine types. And they were kind of appalled at what we had, but still, the idea was to meet with the U.S. and settle what our priorities were going to be, and it turned out that they were going to be Germany first and Italy collaterally. And we were going to let Japan sort of rest in a dormant situation until we had vanquished certainly Germany and Italy along with it, should the United States have gone into war. Of course, there was a large anti-war movement in the United States at the time, and while our military was thinking seriously about it, I'm not sure that too many other folks were, until Pearl Harbor, and that changed everything. Pearl Harbor was the 7th of December. The British came over just before Christmas, their joint equivalent of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they met with. We did not have a Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. We sort of cobbled one together with General George Marshall for the Army, Admiral Ernest King for the Navy. We didn't still have much of an Air Force, so Henry Arnold, Hap Arnold, became he was sort of designated as a deputy chief of staff for air, so he could at least sit in against the British chair, who was Peter Portal, and they worked out again a Germany first situation, even though it had been Japan that attacked the United States. And at this point, one of the biggest enemies of at least the Army Air Corps at that time became Admiral King of the United States Navy. And there was a tremendous fight that ensued over resources because Admiral King wanted the United States Navy to go after the Japanese without regard to the Germans, who had not attacked the U.S. at that point, and wanted the United States to put all of its financial resources into equipping the United States Navy with the finest airplanes and ships and so forth. And that lasted until the 11th of December, when fortuitously Hitler, out of the blue, declared war on the United States. That gave then the Germany First group the priority that it needed. Initially, parts of the 8th Air Force, which happened to be right here in Savannah, Georgia, and it was not an Air Force at the time. It was just simply several air units. One of them, an air support command, was going to go to Great Britain and join with the British in an endeavor in North Africa. That eventually was canceled, and although on the 27th of January in 1941, the United States 8th Air Force was stood up, and in fact, it was the very first offensive Air Force of the United States. The other Air Forces either being training commands or purely defensive units for protection of the United States of America. The problem was that when the 8th Air Force was stood up on the 27th of January, it had no airplanes, no airfields, only 8 personnel, all of whom were officers. There was nobody work on the airplanes that didn't exist. So the work was cut out for it. Very quickly, Arnold called in Ira Eaker, whom he had known for quite a while, and Eaker was sent immediately to England with several other folks, 6 others, with the idea that Eaker would take over command of all of the folks in England, the Americans in England, with the exception of those working directly in the American embassy, which were about 34 under a Major General Cheney. And he would start putting together facilities for an 8th Air Force arrival eventually. Nobody knew when it would happen, of course, because they still didn't have any airplanes or very few men. 1,850 were soon to embark on a ship to come over. One of the things they were going to do was walk around parts of England and try to spot farmers' fields and so forth where they could build an airfield or multiple airfields. The bacon of the 8th Air Force was saved by the Royal Air Force, who took them in hand, gave them everything they needed, everything they wanted, everything they didn't know they needed but did, and helped them develop the 8th Air Force, helped them with the airfields, helped them with procedures. Because the British had been fighting an air war for 3 years, they had a very sophisticated air intelligence program. United States Army Air Corps had none, which meant the 8th Air Force had none. But the British very kindly began training American airmen and some Navy and Marine Corps airmen as well in air intelligence, trained them to be photo interpreters, trained them to be intelligence officers. It was a year or more training program at least, but the British gave the United States trainees everything that the British had and more. It was a very unsorted act, and one that was very quite generous on the parts of the British. Everything, including top secret. There was nothing that was kept from the Americans. And people have wondered at that time and ever since if the shoe had been on the other foot, if we, the Americans, would have been as generous to the British. Um, and that's kind of worth thinking about even today, um, because the British had this marvelous air intelligence program, but they didn't have the airplanes and the air crews to make use of it. Whereas the Americans had, as early as the 1930s, mid 1930s and later, a marvelous airplane called the B-17. We're designing to build the B-24, which were long-range strategic bombers, and needed an air intelligence program for particularly these long-range aircraft. Needed all the aspects of an air intelligence program for pre-flight and post-flight debriefings for the air crews to determine what needed to be bombed and how badly it needed to be bombed, and then in post-strike evaluations determined on whether it needed to be rebombed. But we did not have any intelligence capability at all. And so between us and the Brits together, we helped the British build and design a better airplane, and the British helped us develop air intelligence programs. So we both benefited. The British ended up with an aircraft called the Lancaster, a four-engine long-range heavy bomber, could carry a bomb load more than twice what our B-17s and B-24s could carry. So Eaker goes over there, and on the way over, Hap Arnold promises him all kinds of airplanes, hundreds. And he says by April of 1943, you'll be striking deep into Germany with 1,000 heavy bombers. And that's what Eaker expects to do. In the meantime, a man named Carl Spott, a longtime Air Corps officer, is designated to be the 8th Air Force commander. And Ira Eaker will move up to be the commander of 8th Bomber Command, which is the heavy bombers, the B-17s and B-24s. Okay, well, so far so good, except in mid-September, around the 12th or the 15th, an agreement is reached with the British to initially invade North Africa. This was not what the Americans wanted. The Americans wanted to go ahead and, without any experience, without any previous encounters, and with only a modest amounts of fairly old equipment, go directly to France and start fighting the Germans, who were very, very well equipped and very highly experienced. The British talked us out of that, talked Franklin Roosevelt out of it, not the American Army or the American Air Force, but did talk Roosevelt out of it. And Roosevelt then ordered the Americans to join with the British going into North Africa. It was called Operation Torch. And it's a very good thing that we did, because it's where the Americans learned to fight the Germans. It's where the American Army became a professional army in the 7 or 8 months that they fought the Germans in North Africa. The Germans had a very professional army, a very strong army. They had outstanding leadership, and by all accounts, perhaps the Germans should have prevailed in North Africa. But we had Eisenhower, who was named to be the head of the Supreme Command of the British and the Americans and the other lesser organizations that joined in. And we had Doolittle as head of part of the Air Forces that struck back at the Germans. Doolittle had gained a lot of fame for his role in the the strike against Japan in 1942, in April of 1942, off carriers or a carrier. Was had joined the Eighth Air Force as a friend of Hap Arnold's. He and Hap Arnold and Ira Eaker had been friends for a number of years. And while Arnold knew that Doolittle had little command experience, he had left the Air Force or the Air Corps in the 1930s to go to work for Shell Oil Company in developing aviation gasolines, which was fortunate that he did, because his aviation gasolines were what powered the American aircraft in World War II, and much to their advantage over the Germans and the Japanese. Doolittle had been assigned to the 8th Air Force as the commander of the Air Support Command, which was the light and medium bombers command. There was also the fighter command, which had gone to another officer. But with Torch, Hap Arnold moved Doolittle to command the American Air Corps element to Torch, which turned out to be the 12th Air Force. It was also created from scratch. It had no airplanes. It didn't know where it was going to get any airplanes. And Hap Arnold said, well, we'll just take them from the 8th Air Force. This was quite a blow both to Spots, who was going to be the 8th Air Force commander, and certainly to Ira Eaker, who was going to be the commander of Bomber Command. In total, by the time the 12th Air Force was stood up and sent to North Africa, ultimately the 8th Air Force gave up 1,244 aircraft, over 2,000 officers, and over 22,000 enlisted personnel. Spots was asked what remained, and Spots said very little. Very little remained. He also didn't talk very much. So very little also meant he wasn't going to say very little. Eaker was more voluble, though, because they were his airplanes. And while he was supposed to be starting to bomb Germany sometime in the fall of 1942, and then having hundreds of airplanes by April of 43, July rolled around, and by the 1st of July, he had one B-17, just one. By the end of July, he barely had one group. A group was 4 squadrons. Each squadron had 12 active and another 4 to 8 in reserve airplanes. And so Eaker particularly was very unhappy. The very first raid that the 8th Air Force flew was on the 4th of July. It was sprung on Eaker and Spots by Arnold. It was quite a surprise to him. They managed to find 12 light aircraft, light bombers, A-20 Bostons that the United States had sent to the British. And the British very quickly painted out their rondels and painted on the American star at the time. And they found 12 crew in training with the British who could fly them. And so these 12 went with 16 other British A-20s on a raid on on July 4th, which was about 4 days just before Spots and Eaker found out about it. They were very much against it, but went ahead with it. Two of the airplanes were shot up pretty badly. A third one was actually shot down. There were several casualties. An American was captured and became the first of the 8th Air Force to go into captivity. It was kind of a fiasco, but as close as Eaker and Hap Arnold had been, and they were starting to drift apart because of the airplane situation primarily. Arnold was besieged by many voices in Washington, and if you've never lived in Washington or worked for the government in Washington, it's hard to understand the pressures that the very most senior people in government can be under, and particularly the military in time of war. Um, Arnold had a huge responsibility. He had to grow the entire Air Corps, which became the Army Air Forces in the spring of 1941. He had to grow it from basically 2,000 officers and 26,000 enlisted to 2.7 million. He had to take it from 4 air forces, 2 for training and 2 to defend the United States, to almost 20 air forces spread throughout the world, most of them offensive air forces, something that had been prohibited to the United States Air Force previously. Um, he had to find airplanes for all of them, all kinds of airplanes too, not just bombers, heavy bombers, but light bombers, medium bombers, fighters, trainers, different kinds of fighters. He had to establish training commands to train pilots, navigators, bombardiers. He had to find money for all of this. He had to start developing the B-29 even as the war was progressing, so that it would be ready by 1944, when presumably the United States would be far enough into the Pacific to be able to reach Japan with a long range bomber. Um, he was just under an enormous amount of pressure, and Arnold was not an individual to handle pressure. He had a volcanic temper. He could not pace himself. He was into everything, big and small. Um, that's just who he was. He never apologized for it. He worked himself into 5 heart attacks. Eventually, one killed him after the war. But Eaker, on the other hand, had a very simple problem. That was to take airplanes and bomb the crap out of Germany until they surrendered. But he needed airplanes to do it, and for that he had to hound Arnold, who had the rest of the world to think about. And in the meantime, Arnold, who had never sent men into combat, Arnold had never been in combat, Arnold had never led a unit in combat, uh, and had never flown in England. And that part of the continent, England and France and Germany, um, and of course Denmark, Holland, those countries as well. About 15 months out of the year had just terrible weather. It's hard to imagine in America. We don't have any place over here that could have weather as bad. There were days in England and days in France and Germany and certainly in Belgium. I lived in Belgium for 3 years, and I can attest to this, where the clouds started at 300 feet above ground and then were solid all the way up to 30,000 feet. And the aircraft at the time just simply either could not handle it or required a great deal of training. And at the time, initially anyway, the Army Air Forces did not have the ability to bomb through the clouds. Radar was simply being tested at the time. Plus, in the 1930s, there was something called the bomber mafia at the Air Corps Training School at Montgomery Air Force Base in Alabama. And the bomber mafia, as it became known, was only about 6 or 7 officers over the influential officers over the period of about 8 years, 9 years. But these officers had developed something called high altitude daylight precision bombardment. And they did it before the B-17 became an airplane. They did it certainly before radar was developed. And their proposition was that these airplanes could take off, they could overfly armies to industrial sites of the enemy and bomb the enemy uh, and destroy their industrial capabilities to the point that they would surrender. And they would do it all with eyesight. They would develop, and Norden was doing this for the Navy first, and then developed the Norden bomb sight for the Army Air Forces. A bomb sight that would supposedly, as they all like to say, to the point of sickness, that it could put a pickle in a pickle barrel or a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Well, none of these people had ever been to England. None of these people had ever flown in combat in that type of weather. Although some of them had, several of the bomber mafia had flown in World War One, but of course those airplanes were fabric and balsa wood, and so it hardly counted for anything. They insisted, and they, believe it or not, got most of the officers in the Army Air Corps at the time, or the Army Air Corps, to agree that the high altitude daylight precision bombardment was the thing to have and to do. And they convinced themselves that this would work because they went out to the desert in California at Muroc Air Base, which is now Edwards Air Force Base, the big testing center, and and they managed to drop from 12,000 feet bombs into the target area with amazing accuracy in very clear, very still weather, where they were not buffeted by high winds, where they were not flying in and out of clouds, where they were not being shot at and taking evasive measures, uh, uh, and where they could just fly straight and level in very good weather and drop their bombs. And they had everybody convinced that high altitude daylight precision bombardment was the way to go. And that's what Eaker was settled with when he got to England, and B-17s started straggling in 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 at a time over a period of months. In fact, it wasn't until he had been there almost a year that he was finally able to get over 100 B-17s onto a target in Germany. And of course, the weather was pretty bad at the time. It was in January 27th, 1943, in the submarine yards of Wilhelmshaven, not terribly deep into Germany, but they were shot up. They had a 15% loss. Before then, they were bombing submarine pens in France. These submarine pens, by the way, became training targets for the 8th Air Force. This was because the pins had been built by the Germans, and they were so solid that they were indestructible. In fact, the 5 of them on the Bay of Biscay are alive and well today. One of them is used by the French Navy at the French Naval Academy and headquarters in Lorient. The one in Saint-Nazaire, which is a little further south from Lorient. Actually, I've been there in the Welcome Center and the Visitor Center for Saint-Nazaire. Happens to be in one of the units of the submarine pens. They are just indestructible. They were then, and they're still around 80 years later. So after losing a number of airplanes, trying to take out these pins, because Eisenhower, who at that time had gone over and become not only the Supreme Allied Commander for North Africa, but concurrently was the Allied Commander, or the American Army Commander, for all of Europe, as the Commanding General of the European Theater of Operations, United States Army, or ETUSA, which was headquartered in London. Eisenhower was concerned about the troops and the convoys coming from the United States to England and the supplies that they were carrying, and because that was primary U-boat targeting. And so Eisenhower in September instructed uh, uh, Spots and Eaker to concentrate on taking out the U-boats. And of course, they tried, but all they did was lose airplanes until everybody figured out that nothing was going to bring down those pins. And after that, then they were used to indoctrinate new crews to combat, which was turned out to be fairly wise, actually. Speaking of Eisenhower and Hap Arnold and others, um, one of the things I do in my book, uh, but I don't give explanation to it because there wasn't time, there wasn't the room in the book, and it wasn't the purpose of the book. But nonetheless, I do go into some of the um, relationships between these important people, these important generals, whether they were Army or Air Corps or Air Forces or both, um, because it was these relationships that had a lot to do, believe it or not, with the winning of the war. Um, these generals, many of them had known each other for years. They had worked together in Washington, D.C. for one or two or three tours. They had gone to schools together, like the Command and Staff School or the War College or West Point. Spots was class of 1914. Eisenhower was class of 1915. They were basically in the same company because Spots was about a quarter of an inch taller and therefore was what they call a file closer. He walked behind Eisenhower in formation. And so, of course, they knew each other. They might not have been close friends, um, but they knew each other. They talked with each other. And when Spots was chosen by Eisenhower to go to North Africa with him, as Eisenhower eventually had to do and give up the 8th, he took Spots with him. And for the next 3 years, Spots dedicated himself to Eisenhower and Eisenhower's job. Uh, uh, Supreme Commander, first in the 12th, or North Africa, and then in Italy, and then finally through Overlord and into Germany. Spots was with him every day. What I've done so far is to lay the groundwork, the background. Beginning in January of '43, the 8th starts flying. It starts on with 40 or 50 airplanes on a raid, and finally by the end of 1943, it's up to several hundred airplanes on a raid in the last several months. In the meantime, Arnold is pushing Eaker to fly a lot more. Eaker won't do it because of the weather and because he doesn't have the airplanes. Arnold can't give him the airplanes and doesn't understand the weather. And so these two formerly close friends really start drifting apart. At the end of '43, where my book ends, there is a meeting of again of Roosevelt and Churchill in North Africa, and at that time, Arnold fires Eaker, and Doolittle moves up from command of the 15th Air Force to the 8th Air Force in England. Eaker goes to run the whole air show in the Mediterranean. Eisenhower goes to London and takes Spots with him. And that's where I am, because after that it's a whole different ball game. And particularly with the 8th Air Force under Doolittle, because now the planes are going out in 600, 800, 1,000, 2,000 aircraft at a time. So you can see the difference in starting an Air Force from the very beginning and taking over one that is now firmly established. And that is what Doolittle and the world owes to Ira Eaker. And that's the story of the 8th Air Force in the first 2 years. I've kind of rambled on, but I'll be happy to take your questions for the next 20 or 30 minutes, and perhaps I can clear up some of the missing information or confusion on your part. So please feel no inhibitions of asking anything.
Hello there, Mr. Doherty. How are you?
I'm doing very well today, Alex. How are you doing?
Good. How's the weather down there?
Well, right now it's absolutely beautiful. I'm sitting in my office, the door's wide open. My dog is happy, and it'll be nice until a cold front comes through this afternoon.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks a lot for the presentation. I think this is a period of the 8th Air Force history that isn't covered enough. I don't think there's any other book quite like yours that goes through the growing pains and takes us through to when the 8th Air Force changed hands, if you like. I want to ask you, you mentioned that there were 20 air forces in World War II for the Americans. And yet, the only one that we ever seem to hear about is the 8th Air Force. Why is that? Is that because of Stephen Ambrose and Masters of the Air? Why out of 20 do we always focus on the 8th Air Force?
I don't know. The Pacific was a much larger battle than Europe, and there were a number of air forces in the Pacific. General Kenny under MacArthur had several air forces on his own that he oversaw, and there were air forces for Alaska. There were air forces domestically. There were air forces uh, for um, for just about everything. So I don't really know why the eighth has gotten all of the um, uh,
All the glory.
yeah, all the glory, except that we're so close to the British, and we always have been, and ideally always will be, and we have many more Americans going to Europe than we do going to the South Pacific or the Western Pacific.
So, did you watch Masters of the Air? Did you watch the TV series Masters of the Air?
Yes, I did.
Uh,
Read the book too.
my major problem with Masters of the Air, and I don't want to be negative Nelly, is that they're way too good looking. They're these Hollywood actors. They don't look tired. They don't look traumatized. They look like they're basically in a fashion show rather than in an air war. How do you feel about that? That it wasn't really gritty and accurate enough in terms of what was done to them, the psychological impact on them.
No, one thing it doesn't do is show the how heavy the war weighed on these
Yeah,
individuals.
yeah,
That and the fact that uh, they all had trouble sleeping. They all had trouble psychologically coping with what they were doing, or most of them did.
yeah.
And it was a very difficult time for every person who flew over Europe. It was not an easy thing.
No, not at all. And I guess it's but Christmas is coming upon us, and everybody watches the movie "It's a Wonderful Life," and they see Jimmy Stewart. And people forget. I think a lot of people forget that Jimmy Stewart himself was traumatized, if you like. Certainly had serious PTSD, and those famous scenes in the movie where he breaks down. Apparently, legend has it that it didn't take much acting. He just remembered how he felt when he had to deal with the loss of his men during his time in the air. Um, I want to ask you, it's probably a bit of a controversial question, but I think it's one that we should always ask, which is there have been a lot of skeptics. During the war itself, they weren't so loud. People didn't want to hear them. but certainly after the war, you had a lot of skeptics about whether strategic bombing was really that effective. Now, I believe that it was. Albert Speer, wrote long after the war that there was a second front during the war, and it was the most significant loss for the Germans of World War II was the war in the air. But do you think that the German propaganda from World War II, that we were targeting civilians, that we were burning people in the tens of thousands out of their homes, do you think in a way that the German propaganda against us actually had an impact, and that led to, for example, Bomber Harris being denied a knighthood?
Uh,
Long question, but how do you feel about the issue, the debate about the morality of strategic bombing?
yeah, I think the what it showed was that the Americans going into the war were not they were naive. They thought that strategic bombing could be so precise that civilians wouldn't be bombed or disturbed terribly. By the end of the war, uh, uh, the smart folks realized that when you send 1,000 airplanes over, even if they split up, you still have 300 or 400 hitting the same place. That if they have the same target, uh, a factory, that 600 airplanes are not going to drop all their bombs on that one target. There's going to be a wide range of bombs, particularly when you had the weather that was there and the winds that were blowing, the evasive action that the pilots were taking. That the bombs are just going to be scattered everywhere. You were going to be lucky, to take out the target actually in most of the time, and that's one reason why there were repeated raids against the same target, was because it was, each target was so difficult to take out. But the villages and the cities around them suffered greatly. You look at the submarine pins on the Bay of Biscay. The pins were always standing, but the cities of Lorient and Saint Nazaire and La Roche were completely destroyed. There were no Frenchmen left in those cities because there was no place to live.
We have a lot of questions. I'm going to cherry pick this one because for personal reasons. And the question comes from Bob O'Connor, who I believe is our next guest. Anyway, welcome, Bob. And he says, Dr. Doherty, have you read Catch-22? If so, as a pilot and veteran, basically, what do you think about it? And I should add that I just picked up Catch-22 the other day in an airport. Um, and it was interesting. It was very interesting because you had this kind of bleakness, this nihilism, this sense of black humor. Um, if you were in the Eighth Air Force in 1943 and you had a 1 in 4 chance, I've read, of actually being still able to function in a plane by the end of 1943, you know, how did they continue? What kept them going? Why did they get up every day at breakfast knowing that they're basically playing poker every single day? What kept them going?
I think it had to be essentially a sense of duty, and even though they were not professional airmen, um, and they were not professional military, the indoctrination into the military was something for them. Plus, it was a war of survival for the United States, or so they felt. And plus, they were 18, 19, 20-year-old kids for the most part, and pretty impressionable. Um, and they uh, otherwise, it is worth thinking about. What possessed these individuals, knowing that they the odds of making 25 missions was pretty much impossible. That they were either going to be killed or wounded or have a non-combat injury, a mental breakdown of some sort, and yet they kept going. And this shows in the Eighth Air Force that they never had a plane turned back, but they did have some people that just couldn't go anymore.
Yeah.
Um, but
Do you think, do you think that if you took today's American populace and turned them into citizen soldiers, that they would be able to go through a year knowing that they had a 1 in 4 chance of making it to the end? Do you think they would be able to do that today?
No, I think Americans today are very different. You look at the young enlisted in 1941. So many of them were from rural areas, either from farms or from small towns. Um, Most of them had an expectation of just staying in the same place for all their lives and doing the same sort of menial work. And today, uh, I assume youngsters are growing up with the idea of going to college and moving into uh, corporations or professions and becoming, either well-to-do or at least comfortable during their lifetime. And so they have a lot more to lose, I think, than plus they're with all the news channels now, and plus CNN and MS Now and all of the other uh, sources. They're much more attuned to what's going on in the world, and the patriotism, I think, is not quite what it was, in 1941. So
Why,
I don't think I think
why
it's a
are,
different.
why are people less patriotic? Why are young Americans less patriotic? What's that down to from your experience, in your personal view?
Well, first of all, I think because there's no draft. I think the ending of the draft was a terrible, terrible thing.
Right. Can you tell us why the ending of the draft was a bad thing?
Yeah, in my opinion, anyway. Now, I beat the draft by enlisting, so I enlisted at the age of 19. Uh, but uh, without the draft, without the installation of the patriotism and the sense of service that comes with giving 2 years of your life to something that's bigger than you are. Um, that or 4 years, as the case may be, certainly was when I went in. Um, that uh, you don't appreciate what the United States stands for as much. Uh, and schools don't teach, as we found out recently, they don't teach uh, civics. They don't teach American history. They don't certainly don't teach the development of the Constitution and that part of American history like they did when I was going to school in the late 50s and the mid 60s. Kids grow up thinking of science and technology and engineering and that sort of thing, and the idea of learning about America and studying the history and the sociology and the background of it is just simply that's not done anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that that young Americans are never asked or expected to understand what the meaning of a good life is, an ethical life. Instead, they're blinded and distracted by social media, and they worship false gods like sociopathic billionaires. Anyway, I know that we're running out of time, and I really wanted to thank you for an excellent presentation. But I know that you've been asked this many times, and you probably feel uncomfortable about talking about this. But you know what's coming next, which is that you were an Iranian hostage, weren't you, during the hostage crisis? How did that change your opinion of what it is to be a patriotic American?
It didn't change it. It deepened it. I was always a patriotic. I always intended to go into the military service, even when I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. I had an uncle that had been in the Battle of the Bulge, and I greatly revered him. I thought he was a wonderful man, and I saw what later on, as I grew older, I saw what the war had done to him. And he had been captured. He was in one of the the 440, one of those 440. I can't remember it now. The regiments that were in the 106th Division, the whole
Yeah.
division surrendered, and he was in
440
one of the regiments. So
Golden
um,
Lions.
yeah, two of the three regiments surrendered in whole, and the third regiment was decimated. Um, so, and he had gone to Texas A&M, which was then a complete male military school. There was no option for civilian students. So uh, I sort of looked up to him as a guide, and he was very patriotic, and and sort of set the stage for me. So I've always been very grateful to him for that. And then I went to military school before I joined the Marines, and um, and I've never looked back. But I realized that by the time I was selected for officers candidate school and went through that even most of my colleagues and friends in OCS were not as indoctrinated as I was, uh, shall I say? Uh, and,
So
and
how did
and
you just how did you cope with being a hostage?
well, first of all, I decided that everybody's got to be someplace, and that's where I was. Uh, 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 but I had my uncle to fall back on in his time in the Stalag. Um, he didn't talk about it, but I read about it because of him. Uh, I had gone through several um, uh, uh, training programs in the Marine Corps, and particularly as an aviator before going to Vietnam. And one of the things on the carrier going over, we had several individuals, including one who had been in the Hanoi Hilton, and he talked to us for hours a day for almost a week. And so I knew what a tough time it was going to be or could be. And so I was psychologically prepared for it, and it turned out not to be quite as bad as I was prepared for. So I was grateful for that, rather than angry that. Well, I was angry too, but I was also I knew how bad it could be, and it wasn't quite that bad. So I came back with a better attitude, I think, than some of my colleagues who never had in the State Department who had never had a clue.
Right. Well, I want to thank you so much for a really important book because, as I stressed earlier on, people think about the Eighth Air Force, but they forget how the Air Force came about and that miraculous transformation. I'm constantly amazed at how the US goes from a underprepared, um, hands tied behind its backs situation before Pearl Harbor to within just a matter of a couple of years being this incredible powerhouse. I think we don't focus enough on the mobilization, how the US government worked with private industry to create this huge military machine that was a massive force for good and gave us Europeans the freedom we've enjoyed for the last 80 years. So,
Well, Henry Arnold, Hap Arnold was kind of key to that, and what people don't realize was how close he was to George Marshall, and how the two of them worked together, and that that was certainly beneficial along the lines that you've just talked about, and that should be explored. But there's so much we'll never know.
Thank you so much for your time. Please come to DC. We'll give you a tour of the memorial. And I hope you have a wonderful Christmas and a great weekend.